In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. Please be seated. Something is missing from the Gospel this morning. For reasons that we don't know, the people who organized the lectionary readings decided that we would read bookends of the story while skipping over a whole section in the middle. So as you can see in your bulletin, we read verses 30 to 34 and then we skipped over some 20 verses and then picked up the story later. As always, when reading Scripture, it's critical to pay attention not only to the story at hand, but what surrounds it and what comes in between. So I became curious about the part that was missing from the reading today. Now we heard that the apostles have gathered around Jesus and they've returned from their first big mission trip out on their own. And it was all a great success. And they're regathered, they're having a nice reunion, and they're telling Jesus all about what they did, and all the teaching and the healing and the praying that they did out on their own. Now Jesus knows very well that praying and teaching and healing people is tiring. It can be depleting, especially with all the crowds that are now following them around. Remember when the bleeding woman touched the hem of Jesus' cloak, and it was said that he felt the power go out of him. And he often needed to go off by himself to rejuvenate. We hear this throughout all the Gospels. Jesus withdrew. Jesus went off to a solitary place to pray. Jesus went out and sat by the lake alone. Jesus went up the mountain in private. So like a wise and caring leader of his new disciples, he urges them to go and find a quiet place to rest. They're going to need it. They're going to need spiritual and physical energy for the journeys that lie ahead of them. Because more and more people are following them and demanding attention. So Jesus says, go off and find a place and have some quiet time by yourselves. You deserve it. You need a rest. But the people see them going, and the crowds run ahead of them and fill up the quiet space. There's no place for the weary disciples to rest. The needs of the people are just overwhelming. Now here's what comes next. Here's the part we didn't hear this morning. The disciples came to him and said, "The hour is very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding towns and villages and buy for themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered them, "You give them something to eat." And the disciples' response? They balk. They think it's not in their power to feed all these people here. It's late and they're tired. They just want everybody to go away. But Jesus found out what they had among them. It was 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He blessed it, he broke it, he divided it among them all, and 5,000 ate and were filled. Then he made the disciples go onto the boat and go on to the other side, while he dismissed everyone and told them good night. Have a good sleep. We'll see you tomorrow. And finally, Jesus went up onto the mountain by himself to pray. Now the boat with the disciples in it was out on the middle of the sea, and of course a big windstorm comes up. Something maybe like what we had last night at 3 o'clock in the morning. And Jesus came walking out onto the sea toward them. They thought he was a ghost, and they were terrified. But he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. The disciples were astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. Feeding 5,000 people, walking on water. 2 miracle stories that for some reason we were not intended to hear this morning, but that have a lot to tell us about prayer and how God works in our lives when we allow ourselves to have space for solitude. There's so much that we all have to do in this busy world. There's so many people and activities and things that demand our care and attention all the time. Jesus saw the growing crowds, and he had compassion. Jesus found a way to keep going, even though he was getting worn down. He was getting tired, and he knew at some point he and the disciples would have to stop and rest. This kind of scenario is what I'm seeing play out on Saturdays here at Loaves and Fishes, where we're now regularly serving upwards of 150 people a hot lunch, where our norm had been about 80 or 90. I heard one of the kitchen volunteers a couple weekends ago yell out, "We just topped out at 80 lunches in our first hour." There's no time to rest. The people just keep coming. It's tiring, and at the same time, it's invigorating. We get energy from it. The poor, the sick, those who need healing, those like sheep without a shepherd, abandoned or oppressed by those in power. Those would not go away from Jesus and his disciples, and they will not go away from us now. We cannot simply dismiss them, as the disciples seemed to want to do that day, that evening, when they were tired. Make them go away is the easy response when you're tired and you feel that the power has gone out of you. So it is critical for all of us, for ourselves and for those people with whom we share life in this world, willingly or not, that we do get away, that we do find our own deserted place to pray regularly, that we pause and pay attention to what's on our hearts, and that we are still enough to notice how God is moving. Then, rather than feeling depleted, we can be filled with the abundance of God's love. It is abundant, and we can see how it multiplies to feed everyone's hunger, even when we doubt that there's enough to go around. There is always enough to go around. Then rather than feeling overwhelmed during rough times, which we all have, we can be assured that God is present. He is walking toward us, especially in those times when we feel terrified and all at sea. Jesus tells us to have compassion, to suffer along with others, to have compassion in our hearts and to do strong actions of justice and love. My favorite contemporary theologian, Richard Rohr, you will hear more about him the longer I am with you. He says that being grounded in social action and contemplative solitude is not a luxury for just a few people, but a cultural necessity. We must change the way in which we live. This is how Jesus and we prepare to make important decisions. It's how we prepare ourselves to deal with hard emotions and the inevitable changes that life throws at us. It is how we can be examples for other disciples. We can't, as individuals, do it all, try as we will, but we must do nonetheless. Living a life of work and prayer, a balance of action and contemplation. The Benedictines call it ora et labora, prayer and work. So that rather than having the power go out of us, we find it instead being restored to us, the power that is found in compassion for others and not in domination or neglect of others. Why were those miracle stories of feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the water? Why were these stories of God's abundant love and His ever-presence left out of the reading today? I don't know the answer to that. It is a mystery. But I do believe that the pattern of care and compassion, of seeking prayerful solitude and an opening up to God's action does restore us. And we see that where the story picks up. Jesus and the disciples had once again crossed over and moored the boat. And people at once recognized him and rushed about the whole region and began bringing the sick to him en masse. And after his time alone on the mountain, Jesus was strengthened and refilled by the power of prayer, by the power of being alone with God. And he was ready to receive the miracles that are offered to all of us when we make room to receive them.